I recently watched a video from Otzdarva titled "Many Players Quit DBD Over This," and it's a killer match from his perspective that is obviously very frustrating. Otz is playing Freddy in the match with a completely non-meta build, virtually no slowdown, and the survivors really don't perform that particularly well in a chase. They go down to an M1 killer very quickly, almost embarrassingly fast to be honest, but they managed to draw the game in the end even though they didn't play well. And they could have easily won the match, but only got 2 out because they got greedy at the end of the game. Now throughout the entire match, these survivors are trolling, they're jumping in and out of lockers, abusing exploits that should have been kill switched, and really trying their hardest to bully and piss the killer player off. Now the point of all of this is that even though they were bad in chase, even though they had no problem running in the killer's face, letting themselves get downed, messing around, wasting time, trading hook states, they still would have been able to win the match if they just took the 3 men out. A lot of less experienced killers than Otz would have been absolutely broken by this match. And how did they accomplish all of this? Was it through skill? No. They just simply used every advantage they could. Now personally, I have no issue that they played the way they did. However, I do have an issue with the fact that they played the way they did and were still able to finish all 5 generators and escape. If you look at the scoreboard, they did not outplay Otz, they outperked him. So the reason I chose this match for this video is because it's such a perfect paradigm of what's causing so many issues in DBD. More issues than I think most people actually realize. The divide between survive with friends and solo queue. Every time this topic gets brought up, it always pivots to, well, the solution is to buff solo queue to match survive with friends. Now, the somewhat obvious problem with that is it's impossible to do. You can add voice comms, show builds in the pregame lobby, add emotes, permanent map-wide bond, it would not matter. You will never be able to buff solo queue to match survive with friends. Never. And maybe that wouldn't be the biggest problem in the world if it didn't cascade and cause so many other balance issues in the game for everyone else. Behavior is constantly over buffing and over nerfing everything in the game to try to find a way to balance the game for survive with friends and solo queue. And I'm sorry to tell you, but that will just never happen. So for example, they'll take low tier killers, buff the hell out of them like Hillbilly, and then what's the result? Solo queue players get wiped off of the face of the planet so that Hillbilly can be strong enough to compete with a survive with friends. Then as a result, the devs will look at those stats and look at the perks and say, oh well, background player must be too strong, let's nerf it. DS is too weak, let's buff it. Oh, now it's too strong, let's nerf it again. Like crazy alchemists living in a shack in the woods somewhere, trying to find the perfect formula to balance the game because they refuse to face the obvious truth that no matter what you do, no matter what balance changes you make, survive with friends will always be miles better than solo queue. Now, I don't have the resources to put this experiment together, but I would love to see a competitive team play against a competitive killer once on comms where everyone knew each other's builds, and then a second time where they didn't know each other's builds and weren't on comms. They clearly would all still play very well, but I'm willing to bet the difference would be very noticeable. So what, am I saying that survive with friends needs to be nerfed? Well, keep in mind that every other player in the game, solo queue players and killers, have had to shoulder the burden of poor balance choices and bad experiences for nearly 8 years simply because the idea of touching survive with friends is so taboo. Now, I made the claim before that at some point behavior is going to nerf survive with friends. I stand by that claim. I believe at some point, not too far off, they will add something like an action speed penalty based on how many players are in a SWIP. Some of you probably know where this is going already, but I don't think that's a good idea. The reason why is that it punishes all SWIFs across the game from top MMR to bottom MMR, and as a design principle, I always try to steer away from balance changes that do that when possible, right? So what is the alternative? Some of you surely guessed already. It's my currency system. And the reason I say my currency system and not a currency system is so that if behavior ever tries to actually incorporate one that's different from mine and it fails horribly, I cannot be blamed for it. But let's take a look again at this scoreboard here using my currency system. Now in a 4-man Swift, these survivors would have an individual allowance of 70 points each. A 3-man would be 80 points each, a 2-man would be 90 points each, and a solo gets the full 100 points to spend on their build. And to be clear, this goes for killers as well. Freddy, being the weakest killer tier in the game, gets the full 100 points, just like a solo queue player. And I have a video explaining this all in way more detail if you're interested, but I want to stay on point here. These survivors would no longer be able to stack their builds like this. They would have to adapt and rely more on their skill to make up for their inherent advantage. Let me give you an example. Distortion. If you run this perk as a solo queue player, it hides your aura and lets you know if the killer is running specific perks like Lethal Pursuer and what add-ons they may or may not be running. Pretty good perk, right? But now let's run Distortion in a Survive with Friends. In Survive with Friends, 1 player out of 4 running Distortion hides their aura, allows them to tell their team about every aura reading perk the killer is running so they can play around it. It allows them to know every aura reading add-on the killer is running, and they'll also know every aura reading perk and add-on the killer isn't running, so they don't need to play around it. That's 1 perk out of 16 in a Survive with Friends, compared to 1 perk on a solo queue player. You are never fixing that. You are never balancing that gap. You can nerf Distortion, but it will only widen that gap. It wouldn't solve anything. Distortion is very clearly not the issue there. Background player is not the issue. DS is not the issue. Dead Hard is not the issue. These perks in solo queue are not the same perks they are in a Survive with Friends. They're different perks. The same thing goes with running a perk like Pop Goes the Weasel on Nurse. Is Pop on Nurse really the same perk as it is on Myers? Not really. It has way more value on Nurse, incomparable amounts of value. So what do? Do we nerf Pop again because it's too strong on Nurse, but then turn around and buff it because it's not getting used by non-top tier killers? You know what that is? That's the definition of insanity. It's doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. Now, the main argument you'll hear against this is that you can't punish people for playing with their friends. So I just want to break this down, because it's easy to say things like that because it sounds nice without really taking ownership of what you're implying. So first, you're saying that playing with your friends and having some restrictions on bringing the best possible loadouts, stacking every advantage you can, is a punishment. That's a punishment, right? But everyone else on the game having to deal with bipolar balance choices for 8 years that make the experience fundamentally worse for everyone else, solo queue and killers, is somehow totally fine and not at all a punishment. And Swift is in no way responsible for carrying any of that burden. That sounds pretty entitled, right? Again, you cannot buff solo queue to match Survive with Friends. You can mitigate it, sure, but you cannot match it. You cannot even get close to matching it. So I don't know, guys. How long do we want to keep doing this? How long do we want behavior to have to buff and nerf every killer in the game until they all lose their unique identities, because all of them have to be the perfect same level of strengths with none of the old established weaknesses so that they can compete with Survive with Friends? Personally, I'm getting tired of reading these patch notes and seeing so much time and so many developer resources thrown into the garbage because the devs would rather go in circles forever instead of acknowledging the elephant in the room. And for anyone who says that a currency system is too difficult or confusing to understand, it wouldn't be any more difficult than understanding the character limit on a tweet, right? Like, if you can't understand something that simple, you're either too young to be playing Dead by Daylight, or you must have escaped from the local zoo or something. Like, I don't know what else to say. That said, let me know how you all feel about it. Leave a like if you agree, or dislike if you disagree. Again, I'll leave a link to my full currency video at the end of this video if you want a more in-depth explanation of it. And as always, thanks for watching and have a good one.